Evening, another live stream. Welcome if you're watching wherever you may be watching, or if you're watching this after the fact, welcome. So today, this evening, doing something a little bit different. I've been saying that I wanted to have as much diversity in terms of topics and subject matter that I could cover when I do these live streams and talk to my friends and bring friends of mine on and talk about various subjects. And today we're not going to be talking about Russia and Ukraine. We're not going to be talking really about international issues necessarily, although maybe that works its way into the conversation. But I have with me my buddy Jase Short. He is a PhD student and professor of philosophy here in New York City. He focuses on ancient philosophy, science fiction, monsters, horror, all kinds of fun and weird stuff. Hey, Jase, welcome.
Hi. Thanks, Eric. It's nice to be
How
here.
you doing, Jase?
I'm doing well enough. Just suffering the grad school / parent in New York City life. It's tough, but I'm getting through.
I hear you. Believe me, I hear you. Well, there was a lot of stuff that we could talk about. When I messaged you, I was like, well, I just want to talk to Jace and see, what we could cover.
Yeah.
And I figured that, of course you have this, I don't know, what do you have, Jace? A fixation, extreme interest in issues of monsters, monster movies as a genre, monsters as a concept, I suppose. And I know that some of your studies, as far as Greek classics, mythology, and so forth, also focuses on monsters, right?
That's right. Yep.
So I figured we could talk about monsters and talk about, I guess, maybe the greatest of all the monsters, Godzilla, because, of course, that's one that I love. And you are a fanatic of
I
that.
am.
I mean,
I have
Godzilla is its own
Godzilla.
genre.
Yeah, I have Godzilla tattoos all over my arm. Here's Mothra.
Well, there you
Godzilla's
go.
up here. It's hard to get to, but yes, I'm a fanatic.
Did you write about Godzilla in your contribution? So Jace has an essay contribution in this collection, Giant Creatures in Our World, Essays on Kaiju and American Popular Culture. What was your essay on in that collection?
So it was about, I would say like 50-50 Godzilla and other kaiju, but it's essentially about, when the Fukushima disaster happened, there were all these political cartoons and references to Godzilla and other kaiju. And it was something where someone could see a political cartoon and they see that image of Godzilla and they know immediately what it means. And they know the association. So it was about the idea of these monsters as cultural ciphers. In particular, how they've served as cultural ciphers for nature being out of balance. The original title for one of the sort of more thoughtful kaiju shows was going to be Unbalance. It eventually became Ultra Q. But the idea is essentially like it's this feeling of discovering that you're in a world that is very strange and weird, and you learn that because our human impact is making the world kind of press back. And sort of what distinguishes a lot of these kaiju is that they are they're not just big animals that have to be slain or villains or something. There's a spiritual component. So the essay sort of covers how they are this sort of thing that you can see in a political cartoon and immediately understand it. And also how they sort of got that status from being more than just cash grab entertainment, like a lot of American monster movies were at the time, that everyone just forgets. There's only a handful of American monster movies that people have any real care for. Whereas these kaiju films are beloved, and there's like so many of them that are classics, and they do different things than just, oh, scary monster, kill it, movie's over, roll credits.
So, I mean, I guess that kind of introduces the general question here about monsters and what monsters mean. I mean, what do they represent? Because, of course, the concept of monsters or kaiju or whatever, it exists across all cultures, across all times. So what are monsters and why do we have monster stories?
Yeah, there's this is a big question. It's kind of a new field academically, monster theory. There's but there's a fairly standard edition, this Monster Theory reader. In particular, this essay, Seven Theses on Monster Culture by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, that sort of, I don't know, launched the academic focus on it. And I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, you probably couldn't get many academics writing about this topic, and now it's sort of in vogue. But yeah, okay, at base, what are monsters? It seems that humans produce these universally. Interestingly, there's a fairly new book. I have it here somewhere. It doesn't matter. By David Wengrow, called The Origin of Monsters. And he basically makes this case that you actually see the development of a certain genre of monsters, this composite, multiple animals fused together. And it emerges at the exact same time that you have the emergence of sort of city-state political power in the ancient Near East. So along with the emergence of urbanization and these trade routes and the sort of political military power that comes with that, you have this new sort of universal cultural image of a composite monstrosity. His take is that, there might be some universal psychological fear of wild beasts and the unknown and sort of spiritual whatever, but the kind of monster that we've come to think of as like a giant monster, or something recognizable like the griffin or the hydra from Greek mythology, that is something that comes with vast political change, associated with sort of authoritarian power. I think it's a really interesting thesis, and I haven't, I've thought about writing a kind of at least a review, but if not that, sort of a response to it, because I think it gets some Wengrow makes some good points there, but in general, we make these historical accounts of specific monsters and how they emerge, and that tells us something about the culture that made it. In a sense, the monsters, they like Frankenstein's monster, they ask all of us, like, why did you make me this way and not otherwise? And a sort of theorist, intellectual, whoever who wants to think about it, art critic, if you want to think about it, you kind of want to answer that question: why did we make you? Why did we make this thing? And so that's a very historically specific question. But the question of monsters in general, why do we keep doing this? I mean, my overall take is that we as a species project. It's our most important adaptation. It's the basis of our adaptations with language and our ability to communicate with each other abstractly, to form identities that are more abstract, like belonging to a nation rather than just to your immediate surroundings. These projections, we live with them all day, every day. Everything from performing abstractions like gender until they become real, race until it becomes real, but also something more concrete like money is a good example. This is something that is a real abstraction, so to speak. And I think monsters are another example of this, in a kind of fantasy realm. They're real abstractions, and certain ones resonate at given times, and they're hard to shake. They kind of haunt us. There's a reason why zombies became a big deal in the 20th century, in the 20th and 21st century. And they weren't such a thing before. There were things like vampires before as well, and there's a reason why they emerged when they did, as something really salient.
Or
So
do monsters explain something? Do they exist in order to explain something? Sometimes you think about that, and you think about, at least for me, the modern conception of monsters, and I don't know where you might define the birth of the modern monster. Maybe it's Frankenstein, or maybe it's something else. But the idea that that the monster and the concept of a monster sort of explains these inexplicable, horrible things that exist in our world, that happen every single day, right? That, like, whether it's just inexplicable accidents, whether it's just inexplicable atrocities, or, you know, unspeakable horror that exists in our real world, that we, like, create monsters in order to somehow explain these forces that take our loved ones away from us, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, simple answer, yeah, I think they do. So I think the sense in which they explain something is that some things are just too hard for us to say directly. My biggest example I always cite is Godzilla, the original 1954 film, and its reception in Japan. So,
Perfect example, obviously.
yeah.
Yes.
So, you know, you've got, it's 1 year after the occupation and censorship regime of the United States ended. So it's a film that couldn't have come out before it did in 1954. And, you know, there was interest in making a movie um, about monsters because there was an American monster movie, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which came out sort of on the heels of the hype of the re-release of King Kong. King Kong was really ahead of its time. It came out in 1933. That's a whole other thing to talk about. King Kong and its relationship to colonialism is very fascinating. But anyway, that was inspiring to these Japanese filmmakers, and then it was re-released. And with that, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, they were like, well, let's kind of do our own. But, you know, as an example of, in trying to do their own take on it, they made something just way more, far more of a mature film. Ishiro Honda was the director, and he's a very good director when he puts effort into it. He has some movies that he just sort of churns out. That he just sort of churned out. Of course, he's passed a long time ago. But Honda was, his experience in World War II left him as a pacifist. He had a sort of idealization of the United Nations that you see crop up in a lot of kaiju films. You know, all the nations coming together under the umbrella of the UN or something to fight off some monstrous threat. But anyway, the film, the original Godzilla, is really dark. It's violent. It has these frightening moments, like, you know, for an audience then, of course. I'm sure people today would not find it as frightening, but there's a moment where there's a woman holding her two kids and they're cowering in the street. And she says, they'll be, don't worry, they'll be with your father soon. And the references to the father's died in World War II. And one of the main characters, Dr. Serizawa, is, he wears an eye patch from wounds that he sustained in World War II. And in general, the sort of theme with the character system in that is you've got Serizawa's sort of this lost generation, and he's set to wed Emiko, young Emiko, but she's drawn to young Ogata, who was part of this non-war generation, who, you know, didn't see these horrors, and you know, long story short, making a film about the bombing of the U.S. bombing of Japan, not even the nuclear bombing, but like the just the bombing, the fire bombing of Japan was so destructive. You know, making a movie about that was impossible. Making a movie about nuclear weapons was impossible. But they made this movie, and on the heels of a disaster, the Lucky Dragon #5 disaster, in which the United States was testing nuclear weapons, and a Japanese fishing vessel got too close. The Lucky Dragon #5, fitting name and its association with the film. And anyway, the crew was hit with high dosages of radiation, and the bomb was much bigger than the U.S. expected. So it resulted in essentially this panic across Japan as they were pulling fish from the shelves, finding more and more of them were radioactive. The ship's actually in a museum in Japan now. I think it might be in the museum might be in Hiroshima. I'm not sure. But anyway, there's references to that in the film at the beginning. There's sailors, there's fishing boats, and there's this bright light flash beneath them, and their ships are immediately destroyed. And anyway, by the end of the film, you have this really somber moment of reflection after Tokyo is just completely destroyed. And it's not done in a way that later monster movies would be like, whoa, cool, look at that, whoa, awesome, that was destroyed. It's more like, oh my god, that was destroyed, oh my god, that reminds me of something that I witnessed. There's characters who are reading the newspaper on the way to work in Tokyo in the movie, and they say, are we going to have to start getting in the bunkers again? I don't want to do that. And someone's like, I'm not doing it. If it happens again, I'm not getting back in the bunkers. So, sort of referencing the air raids. So yeah, in a sense, it was a way for the culture to experience, think about something that they couldn't approach directly. And it showed. People were weeping while they were watching this. People were, moved genuinely by it in a way that, it's sort of a cultural moment with like films being introduced in a real way, sort of return to pre-war living standards. And there's this awesome big budget thing, and oh my god, it says something deep about us that I wasn't expecting.
And how cool is it though to juxtapose, and by cool I mean awful, to juxtapose that with how the movie was received by American audiences, right?
Yes.
Who come out of the theater quite literally laughing, right? So and although there were, I think, pretty significant changes between the version that was shown in the United States and the original version shown in Japan, even so, the entire subtext, which does remain somewhat in the US version, is totally lost on the vast majority of Americans who laugh at this movie.
Yeah. Excuse me. Choking on my water.
Choking on your vape, bro.
You would think, based on what you just witnessed. I wish I had, because I could recover from that better. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, the history of the changes to Godzilla movies is in itself fascinating and something I want to talk about in just a moment. But yeah, in terms of things that were lost, there's a scene in the original where there's a Dr. Yamane is presenting this truth about Godzilla and the connection to nuclear testing. And essentially, one faction of the parliament that represents the Liberal Democratic Party, sort of center-right reactionary party, they say, we can't tell anybody about this. This will ruin us. The Americans will ruin us. No, this has to be sealed tight. And these women stand up and they're like banging their hand on the table and saying the truth is the truth, and we have to speak the truth. And they're supposed to represent the communists, opposition in the parliament. So it's just something that Americans see it, and it's just nothing, no reference there. I will say, so the American one, it was released, Godzilla King of the Monsters. There's another film, 2019, a Hollywood production that used that name, and they added scenes with Raymond Burr, and those aren't bad. And that's the thing that I think some people miss, is like Raymond Burr took this real seriously. He's one of the reasons why Godzilla did get some sort of audience in the United States. And then the later film that I'm going to talk about in a minute, Godzilla 1985, when it was made for US release, the company that did it wanted to change the soundtrack and make it really wacky. And he was like, that's not what this is. This is a very somber and serious movie like the original. So Raymond Burr, he really he tried, and you can, you hear it, and it's very melodramatic account where he narrates events in the movie. It's kind of like his character got what was going on, and he took an American interpretation of it, and it's kind of fitting in a way. But yes, you lose so much. You lose a lot of the dialogue. They don't even dub some of the dialogue. Sometimes it's just sort of Raymond Burr's watching them, and the way the first one shot, it's this really interesting style. It's very documentary, and it's very like this mixture of sort of French, American, and Soviet film style stuff, the kind of like mixes that you could get, at that time, before everything was just Hollywood all the way down. So yeah, there was less of a focus on America, of course, and more of a focus on like it's atomic weapons are bad.
All right, so let's back up for a second
Sure.
because we actually jumped into Godzilla before I was ready
Yeah,
to. So, but that's fine, no
sorry.
problem. No, we go with that. So, Godzilla comes out in Japan in 1954.
Right.
So we're talking less than 10 years has passed since the bombs, right? So
Right.
this is not only fresh in people's memory. I mean, this is a living wound that, like, you know, everyone is still kind of grappling with in various ways, right? So how is this movie received by the left? Is there any left-wing understanding of this? Well, first of all, how is the movie interpreted in Japan? Is this even a left-wing film in Japan, or is this just kind of a liberal, you know, center liberal kind of, you know, understanding of what they've all collectively gone through? What's the political orientation of the film in the Japanese context of 1954? And then maybe more broadly, how is it received?
I would say it's, you know, it's only it's not left in the very strict sense. It's a critique of U.S. imperialism that's soft. It doesn't really like name names of the Americans. It does, but only in passing. The Americans are more the villain in the 2016 film Shin Godzilla, where their intervention threatens to actually destroy the city of Tokyo, whereas Godzilla is just sort of walking through it. So anyway, in this original one, it's an interesting politics where, yes, it's a kind of liberalism. It's a kind of liberalism that's had its day. It was something, I think, in the post-war period where there were liberals in the United States and Japan and elsewhere who were friendly with socialism and communism in some way or another. But they weren't fully embracing it. You know, they weren't fully embracing class struggle or anything like that. But they had an interest in peace and universal progress of humanity and technological progress, and sort of the idea that like we would unite together into a super nation and like take off to the stars. There's a lot of that in the films of Ishiro Honda. Of one of the favorite films that he made, Gorath, he says is his favorite film. There's sort of a they call it a planet, but it's like a meteor or asteroid or something on the way to Earth, and humanity gets its shit together and everybody works together to across borders to take it down. Like that's sort of his idea. That's sort of Honda's vision, and he's very much a pacifist. He doesn't like military stuff. In general, when military forces get involved in his movies, they make things worse, not better. I think that's kind of a general marker of a good kaiju film is like, what's the status of the military? Are they the good guys, or are they really screwing stuff up? Honda was very good friends with Akira Kurosawa, and they worked on films together. Honda helped, you know, with the directing of Ran and some other stuff, and Kurosawa said, you know, the thing is, the reason why I won't ever make one of these Godzilla movies is when you make them, there's a policeman, and he's guiding people out of the city in the midst of the disaster. In my film, the police would be the first to run. So I think that's sort of like a, you know, the move from liberal, and then Kurosawa's got more of like a left-wing view. It would be a little more extreme. But yeah, how it's received by from a political perspective, you know, I think people didn't take that kind of art as seriously at the time as sort of a blip of interest. Like, wow, it's good that people are talking about the atomic bomb issue. Because before the Lucky Dragon incident, most people in Japan didn't really understand what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was not widely known and understood. There was, you know, deliberate misinformation, deliberate holding information back, and it's not like people just had like, you know, open up your iPhone and here's image of the most recent devastation. And they heard big bombs, and they're like, wow, even bigger than what they've already dropped, and it's horrible. Like, I can't even imagine. But that's sort of the end of it. But after a while, information started to get out. People are sick. People are getting sick by going back there. Some weird stuff happened with the bomb. This is not a normal weapon. This is not a normal situation. And after the Lucky Dragon incident, there was this sort of outpouring of like, tell us more. We want to know more about this. Is something we want to um, engage with on a political level. So anyway.
What about in the U.S. though? When the U.S. version comes out, I mean, is it stripped of most of whatever overt political content it had, to the point where, I mean, because I'm trying to think, what year does it come out in the United States?
56.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking McCarthy, you're talking HUAC, you're talking, the height of all of that. So I guess I guess one would expect that most of the overt politics was stripped out of the U.S. version, right?
Yeah, there's just a general, mankind has gone too far with atomic weapons. Just that, and that's about it. But anything that's a reference to World War II, gone. Any of the sort of social commentary where the relationships in the character system and sort of all the pathos involved with that was completely lost on American audiences. You've got this guy who's sort of like he's a genius. He's sort of, Dr. Sarazala is kind of like an Einstein sort of figure. And yet he's scarred and lives alone in his basement. And the woman he's betrothed to isn't in love with him because of what happened to him, because the damage done. He's just this dark, brooding, Einstein character who's turned into Dr. Frankenstein. And then on the other hand, you have these bright, excited young people who didn't see that era. So there's, it says a lot. That's just gone in the American version.
So, okay, what movie comes next? What comes after the original Godzilla in the, well, actually, you know what, before we get to that,
Sure.
Let's back up, because I didn't ask the other question I wanted to ask you. We discussed monsters in general as a kind of a universal concept, but monsters or kaiju means something even more specific in the Japanese context. So can you explain what the kaiju represents and how this is connected to Japanese history, Japanese culture, and most importantly, what the, I guess, metaphorical meaning that is not lost on Japanese viewers? What is that?
So this is an interesting question, because it's a term, kaiju, that's sort of morphing as we speak. It's in the last 10 years has become part of the language of popular culture. Godzilla was language of popular culture for a long time, but we didn't even have this word kaiju for him for a long time. So there's an umbrella of fantastic creatures that sort of under the term yokai. And yokai are these sort of liminal entities. There's something between divinities and woodland creatures. And all of them are sort of grotesque in some way or another. And one variant of them are the kaiju. And kaiju means like strange beast. So the idea is it's more animalistic. And in the use, in the way the language was used in Japan for the longest time, so a kaiju could mean like Dracula, but daikaiju meant a giant monster. So that was sort of the main division in Japan for a long time. Now, we've sort of dropped dai, and kaiju just means daikaiju, it means the giant monsters. But the idea that I think that the simplest way to think of it is that in most Western contexts, whether it's spirits or creepy goblins, whatever they are interruptions of the norm. They are sort of invading space, our everyday space. And with yokai and kaiju, there's always a sense in which the reverse is happening. We're sort of made aware that we are on their land. We are in their world. There's a sort of enweirding of the world that takes place once kaiju are encountered, because the world made something like this. And in a sense, it is more continuous with the world than we are. We are more like an alien entity than the things around us. And in a Western context, it's sort of like this thing that intrudes, and in this, it's sort of like we've discovered that we're intruding. Um, so there's always a sense in which they have a spiritual component to them. Kaiju are related, and like I said, there's sort of a continuum of these entities, and it kind of goes all the way to the kami. Kami are what in Shinto would refer to as sort of, our analog would be gods, but like big, powerful forces of nature that in some sense are conscious, but in some sense are also forces of nature. And that's ultimately what kaiju are, is that they're sort of symbols of forces of nature. You've got Rodan flying over a city, and the imagery that happens there is like of a hurricane. Godzilla rising out of the water in a giant wave crashes to the shore. Tsunamis. So there's for kaiju, there's this strong sense that they carry with them sort of a realm and a message that isn't inherent to other forms of monster, I would say.
How does this connect to spiritual understandings, Shintoism, and so forth? Right. I mean, it's connected in various ways to some of these religious structures that predate any of these modern kaiju stories, right?
Yeah. In general, like I think this is a much bigger topic, but here in our sort of world that has been made by this entity, the West or whatever, we think of religion as a very as something that involves special beliefs, beliefs that can't be proven. What if it's not true? Kind of, or let's prove that it's true or prove that it's not, kind of thing. And in general, religion is more like of a practice that people do throughout history. So like in ancient Greece, somebody said something like, I don't believe in Zeus. I'm like, I don't give a shit. Are you coming to the festival? Yeah. Well, okay. That's religious practice. A similar kind of thing is going on with Japanese religion, Shintoism. It's very practice oriented. It's very much embedded in the way people, at least at the time, structure their daily lives, structure their homes and so forth. There's a sense that there were spirits that are involved with like your kitchen, spirits that are involved with house cleaning, everything. And, not in a very superstitious way, and in a way that's sort of interesting and harmonious, where like you see the world as alive, some sort of animistic in a sense. The world is living. And kaiju are sort of emanations, I think, from that sensibility. So the one way to put it is that in the American monster movies, what you had was a big animal that's on the loose. And that big animal then needs to be tamed, it needs to be killed, it needs to be captured and returned, whatever it might be. But with kaiju, there's a kind of transformation that people undergo once they encounter them. There's the sense of awe and respect for nature just sort of impresses itself upon them. There's a sense of like transformation that happens, like I said, but also there's often these characters who have particular relationships with the monsters, some sort of psychic connection or something like that, and they'll kind of be spokesmen for it. There's one really great scene in Godzilla versus Biollante, one of my favorite Godzilla movies, where there's all these psychic kids, and she's like, okay, kids, you said you had some strange dreams last night. Can you show me your drawings? What did you see? And they're like, yeah, and they all hold up they're all holding up pictures of Godzilla that they drew. And it's at that moment that you hear the classic Godzilla music. They're like, dun, 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 dun. So the moment of Godzilla's entry in that movie is these kids' dreams. And I think that sort of captures some of the spiritual imagery really well. As entities, they are fascinating to us in our sort of childlike wonder. And there's an attraction as sort of children, and as adults, there's a sort of terror, a sort of like recognition of a world that's out of our control, that's stranger than us, and that we won't be able to exert control over. Children are at home in that because they already don't control the world. The adults, it's much more of a loss that's taken in. Anyway, that's my take on kaiju's relationship.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's interesting. So to come back to, all right, we already talked about the original Godzilla quite a bit. So I want to ask you, and we're not obviously there's, I don't know how many are there, 746 Godzilla
30
movies
or
at this
so.
point. No, I mean I know there's like 29. I think they're going on 30 or whatever, but we're not going to talk about all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I do want to highlight the most important ones, at least in your mind, some of the most important ones. And I think there probably will be some overlap in the final portion of our conversation where I'm going to ask you to name 5 monster movies that you believe leftists all should really see and think about. But before we get to that, what is the next important Godzilla movie in your mind? 1954, the original Godzilla comes out. 1956, the US version comes out. What comes next?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. There's sort of 2 answers to that. So one is it's not a Godzilla film, it's Mothra, 1961's Mothra. And what happens in Mothra is you have the full break from the American structure of the monster movie. Godzilla, for all of its originality, does have a sort of ending in which the monster is slain and sort of exorcised. And there's talk of like in the future it's going to come back and blah, blah, blah. But it more or less follows this pattern. Mothra, what you have is a kaiju that is beautiful rather than ugly. Its terror is inspired by its beauty. Of course, looking at old imagery, it's perhaps not as beautiful to us, but the idea is that she's initially a caterpillar, but then she's this beautiful moth with this gorgeous pattern on her wings. But when she flaps her wings over the city, there's hurricane winds and mass destruction. And what she's doing in that film, there's a very direct fantasy thing going on. There's this island of an ancient civilization, and they worship Mothra as their god. And her priestesses are these twins, the fairies, who are little miniature people. They were played by this famous twin duo musical team called the Peanuts in English. Anyway, they're kidnapped by a businessman and put on display. And there's a whole theme about greed and capitalism at work. And Mothra inflicts her destruction on them for that reason. And there's a country in that called Rolisica that is a mixture of the United States and the Soviet Union, or supposed to be. It looks like the United States more than anything. Their capital city is Newkirk City, I think. Anyway, Mothra really lays on thick the spiritual angle and the sense of divine beauty as a component of this. It's there in the subtext of Godzilla. It's sort of an unsettling beauty. It's a less of a beauty, more of a fire and brimstone encounter with a god. This is more of an encounter where like the notion of people's like angel encounters where the glory of God blinds them. So I think that's significant, and the shift to focus on greed that happens in the next Godzilla movie, King Kong versus Godzilla, and so on. But the big one I would say is Godzilla versus the Smog Monster. So this is in the 70s. It's 1971. It's very experimental, very strange. For some time now, Godzilla films have been popular. They moved from the somber, serious original to like, let's have monsters battle. There's still a lot of messaging about world peace, scientific progress, all that stuff shot through all of them. But the kind of heavy-handed anti-imperialism stuff is not present. And they try to bring the Americans in a few times, but it's complicated. Anyway, the Smog Monster, what this does is this is sort of a moment in Japanese history where there were cities where they had oxygen tanks on the side of the road for people on their way to work and on their way to school to breathe, because the pollution was so horrendous. This is the 70s. This is coming off after the big boom, after the Korean War and all the investments the United States put into Japan. And there's a lot of this really pristine, beautiful country was just a mess. And it's a lot of the last 20 years of stories of China's development really parallel this, cities with the oxygen tanks and all that kind of thing. So that's where the smog monster came from, Hedora. He's this creature that feeds on that. He feeds on our waste. So he's got a lot to eat. And as he flies over people, they asphyxiate and turn into skeletons. The film has got all this weird psychedelic stuff. It's more experimental, kind of plays with what's reality and what's not a few times, which is not something we do in Godzilla movies usually. And Godzilla is an out-and-out hero in this. And in a sense, there's an allegory at work that's kind of heavy-handed. Nuclear power is pretty clean. These coal-fired power plants are not. And we should get over our fears of nuclear energy and invest in that. And so, there's and that is a thing in Japan. They have lots of nuclear power plants. Sort of per capita, I think like Japan and France are really the most.
It is so interesting. It never occurred to me, Jace, but now that you say that, the transformation in the narrative of these films about nuclear technology from 1954 to 1971. I mean, we're talking 15 years or so, and you have a change from nuclear, the scars of our very recent past, and the need for peace and so forth, to, as you say, nuclear as this peaceful energy, clean energy source, etc. Right? A transformation of the very idea of nuclear tech.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it's definitely a theme that's going on. And we don't see the ominous theme return until the next one that I think is significant. The Japanese release, which I think is available now, is called The Return of Godzilla, which came out in 1984. The American version is called Godzilla 1985. That's what I grew up with, was Godzilla 1985. That was the first one I saw when I was like 3 years old. Far too young for that film. But it's seared into my memory. They brought Rangan Burr back. It's supposed to be a direct sequel to the original. And there's this nuclear standoff that happens. So this happens in the 80s when Japan is sort of becoming this new global power. There's all this talk of Japan's going to be the new world superpower. It's going to surpass the United States at that time. And there's sort of Japan phobia stuff happening in the US at the same time that there's Japanese philia stuff happening with the introduction of more and more Japanese culture, from monster movies to Ultraman and anime and so on.
Michael Keaton film Gung Ho, if anybody remembers that movie, about the Japanese who come to take over the American auto plant. Great movie.
Yeah,
great movie. It kind of speaks to that cultural feeling during the Reagan years.
There's a later, like 1990 Godzilla film in which in the future Japan buys entire continents and just like owns the world. But anyway, so what happens here is Godzilla returns, and when he first returns, he wrecks a Russian sub, a Soviet sub, and so the Americans think it's, the Soviets think it's the Americans, and the Americans are like, well, we didn't do it, but who did it? And the Japanese government knows that it's Godzilla, but they've been trying to avoid panic, and they're like, okay, well, we have to tell people now, because there's going to be a nuclear war if we don't. So they do. And the Americans and the Soviets are like, well, we'll help. How can we help? And they're both sort of browbeating the Japanese prime minister together. You must let us use nuclear weapons. And he says, no, we will never do this in Japan. We will never allow the use of nuclear weapons on our soil, ever. In the end, in the Japanese version, what happens is there's a Russian vessel in the harbor that's supposed to
spoiler alert.
Launch. Yeah, it's a spoiler. So
it's a 40-year later spoiler alert.
To launch a nuclear weapon in case Godzilla does show up in Tokyo. The ship is wrecked and it starts to auto send the missile. So the Russian is bleeding and dying and trying to get to the shutoff. And he's like, I've got to stop the missile. I've got to stop the missile. So all they did was they changed the subtitle dialogue in the American version to, I've got to launch that missile. I've got to launch that missile. Yeah. So they completely shifted what happens.
Love it.
But either way, the missile launches, and it's after Godzilla is knocked out with these experimental weapons that are meant to sort of dissipate radiation or sort of eat at radiation. The Americans intercept the nuclear weapon with one of their weapons, sort of Star Wars style, like Star Wars as in Reagan Star Wars, SDI.
Right, Star Wars. Yeah.
And the radiation from the blast reawakens Godzilla, and he wrecks things again. So there's sort of the superpowers in their attempts to do something have made things much worse at work. And in this film, it sort of introduces, I think, the best version of Godzilla, if we're going to think about him as an image of this nuclear terror. He literally is seeking out nuclear power plants to consume. So he like rips them open and just sort of, as the reactor is, melting down, he's pulling all of it in and consuming it. That image, I think, is probably the best for having a consistent entity at work in these films that sort of makes sense for like what it's doing, what its purpose is. It's kind of like a nuclear zombie, something that should have died but didn't, and to sustain itself in this sort of immortal nightmare that it's living, it's going to continue eating nuclear energy as long as humans are making it.
So now we're into the mid 1980s. I mean, what's the subtext here? Do we have any? Because I mean, from the Japanese, I can't really speak to the Japanese perspective. In the West, the anti-nukes movement reaches its peak during this period in the post. Well, I guess 1985 is pre-Chernobyl by a year, but the anti-nukes movement in the West reaches its zenith in the from the late 70s and into the 1980s. So how is this received, and to what extent is there any political subtext changing from the 70s to the 80s version?
There's definitely a focus. There's a separation of nuclear energy from nuclear weapons. I don't know, that it's sort of the main political point that's made in that film, I would say, is that Japan sort of transcends this Cold War conflict, and the two entities, the two sides of the Cold War, don't represent the interests of Japan, and Japan can sort of lead the world into a much brighter future without these forces holding them down, which is not entirely divergent from stuff that was around in the 70s. There was another film, it's sort of lost. There's no, as far as I know, there's no way to get even like a Japanese version of it right now, but it's one of Honda's movies, was called The Next War. And it was just literally the US and the Soviet Union going to war over nonsense effectively and destroying the Japan in the middle, and everyone else is destroyed in the midst of it. That same theme is shot through this, that we are the helpless victims of these superpowers. So that's that next big, I'd say, political message, but it's really a magnification of what came before. And the focus on nuclear weapons is like, well, we in Japan, we don't build them, we don't test them. It's you people that do it, and you're the ones who've made this mess.
Now that's 1985. 4 years later, there's another film that comes out in 1989. I know that you wanted to highlight. Which one is that?
Godzilla versus Biollante, which is one of my favorites. It is a delight to watch. It's got a dubbed HBO release in the 90s. It was the only one of that series that was widely available in the 90s, and really it wasn't until like 1999, 2000 that we got to see the others. And this, it's a continuation of the story of Godzilla 1985. We do have another monster, but they try to keep the science fiction grounded. So Godzilla is still the strange thing, the strange being that for whatever reason, its genetics allow for it to consume radiation and to repair itself on a scale that's not understood by science, and they're trying to understand it. They're studying Godzilla's genetics to try to reverse engineer parts of it to help with the production of everything from plants to the production of anti-nuclear energy bacteria. And there's this subtext in it of the rise of big pharma. It's really like there's this international espionage, James Bond style conspiracy where this American company is assassinating people, trying to get its hands on the Godzilla cells to study. This Japanese scientist is using it. He lost his daughter in one of these attacks that the Americans have done on their labs, and he's got this Dr. Frankensteinish thing where he wants to bring his daughter back. So he splices her DNA, plant DNA, and Godzilla DNA together, and it starts to grow. And then, lo and behold, there's a new monster. It's Biolante. It's like a plant Godzilla human hybrid, and it's not sort of the big bad in the movie. Godzilla remains the big bad, is the frightening thing. The political thing is sort of shifted to looking at corporate greed and sort of their race for new technologies without regard for the consequences for humanity. Whereas, you know, our main not main character, but the scientist in that film, he's Shiragami, I think is his name. He's trying to, like I said, at first he wants to make the deserts bloom. That's his dream, is to make this highly adaptable, extremophile style plant that can, you know, using Godzilla cells. So he wants to use it for this good. The Americans want to use it as a weapon. And there's a fear that the anti-nuclear energy bacteria could be spread and could eat through nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and so there would be no nuclear weapons in the world, and would throw the balance of power off. There's all this kind of stuff shot through it, so it's neat that it introduces sort of new themes and shows the sort of the viability of Godzilla and the genre, even as it moves beyond its roots.
Well, so Godzilla kind of evolves as we've been sort of tracing from the 50s and through into the 70s and the 80s, and the evolution of Godzilla in the last 10 years is really quite remarkable in terms of what's come out, the films that have come out, the variety of films, the variety of approaches. And I'm ignoring obviously the I forget what it was, 1997 version with Hank Azaria and whoever else was in that movie, I forget.
Matthew Broderick.
Matthew Broderick, thank you.
Were the French the bad guys?
Yeah. The 90s, right? So, you know, but that movie is kind of a weird outlier in a sense, right? I think the modern iteration begins probably with the 2014 version here in the United States. So I don't know if I guess it makes sense to go chronologically. So why don't you talk about the 2014 version, then we could talk about Shin Godzilla again to whatever extent that's important.
Yeah.
2014 Godzilla, that's the one that many of us probably have fresh in our minds. Talk about the 2014 version.
Right. So it's an interesting movie. The hype for it for me was incredible because I had been waiting for this for so long, for them to do a real Hollywood blockbuster budget Godzilla film since I was little. And when I was a teen, that's when the 1998 thing came out, and I was so excited. And I got there, and I was like, "Oh my god, you just blew it! You blew it!" So here, all the talk was, it's gonna be somber. It's gonna have the same messaging as the original. It's all this and all that. And the trailers really give you that feel of this sort of political, dark political turn that's unfolding as this thing emerges, and humanity is just ill-equipped to take care of it, and there's governments keeping secrets and all this. The actual film's kind of a mess the way it's put together, and this has to do with Hollywood crap. It has to do with the Pentagon too. The Pentagon, everyone I think is pretty aware, it works really hard to manufacture a certain image of itself in films. And the most that they would accept was that the U.S. military was unable to stop the monster and was desperate, but was still basically trying to save people. You know, there's a scene where there's like two U.S. Navy destroyers going like side by side with Godzilla, and as an image, I was just, at the time I just couldn't really handle it. I was very angry. I was like, that's not what.
Why do you hate America, Jase?
Well, I mean, I hate U.S. imperialism, and Godzilla has long been, a sort of, at least on a soft level, opposed to it, because he wrecks their stuff. He doesn't swim along with it. So basically, though, in this film, there's a kind of a switch where the main monster focuses on this other creature, the Muto, and the Muto is sort of it's a cool monster. It's like a mixture of the arachnids from Starship Troopers and like the aliens from like the xenomorph aliens, chestburster style. It's one of them has a sort of ape gait that's supposed to make you think of Kong and all this other stuff. It's kind of a composite entity, and it's interesting. But people went to go see a Godzilla movie because they wanted to see Godzilla, and there's only about 12 minutes of Godzilla footage in the whole film, and that would be fine if thematically Godzilla was the threat that centered everything, and he wasn't. So it's just an odd film, but visually
that kind of worked with Cloverfield.
Yes.
That kind of worked for Cloverfield, where it didn't work for 2014 Godzilla.
Yeah, because like Cloverfield, there's still not a lot of monster footage, but it's incredible because the monster's presence is suffused through the whole film, and we're not really sure what presence is suffused through this film. It's just sort of, and then they bring Bryan Cranston in and they kill him in the first act, and he's such a brilliant actor, and he really was carrying that film.
Such a strange decision.
Terribly weird decision. So and they also had I forgot her name, the French woman who's in it. She's in like Amélie and Chocolat as well. It's in Chocolat, maybe not Amélie, but anyway, she's Julie something. She's really good, and they gave her like 5 lines, and it was sad. Such a waste. But as a film, one of the things that it did was it symbolically, Godzilla emerges more or less from Japanese waters, and then there's an event in Hawaii and then on the West Coast. So it's like, okay, we've moved. Godzilla started over there, and we had our stuff in Japan for a little bit, but we've moved over here now. Japan's in the rearview mirror. And
I completely forgot Juliette Binoche was in Godzilla.
She dies in the beginning, and that really
completely forgot the two best actors of the last 25 years are in that movie, and both die very early.
Imagine my excitement when they're talking about this film and the themes that they're going to do, and they put all this effort into it and have this creative control, and they got these two actors, and I was just like, whoa. And then this is what we got. So, and it's not a terrible film. It's just there's just some mistakes, I feel like, in the
Ken Watanabe tried.
Yes, he did try. Yeah, he did well enough. He has a very moving scene in the next one, Godzilla King of the Monsters, and in which he gives his life for Godzilla, which is a really powerful, I think. He's the character's name has the same name as Dr. Serizawa from the original film, and Serizawa in the original, he develops this weapon of mass destruction, and he doesn't want humanity to have it, but he knows it can kill Godzilla, so he destroys all of his work, and when they use it in the water, he cuts his line so that he stays in the water and dies with it, so no one else can use this. So he sacrifices himself to stop Godzilla, and in this one, there's a kind of reversal where he is sacrificing himself in order to save Godzilla, because there's sort of a bigger threat at work in this other film. But they try in the legendary films to get into the image, especially with Godzilla King of the Monsters, of the kaiju as divine. And in the Kong movies, the Skull Island one that they have in this universe, there's a lot of, in that Kong movie especially, there's a lot of Miyazaki influence. There's a lot of shots that are, just live action versions of Princess Mononoke or one of these anime films that really captures a environmentalist theme, and a theme of like that in weirding that I'm talking about, where like we learn that the world is weird, and that we're sort of our normalcy is what's actually alien. So that they kind of they try to build that in the next in Skull Island and King of the Monsters. They only kind of hinted at that in Godzilla 2014.
So 2014 comes out. I mean, it was cool. I remember. I think I saw it in the theater. It was
Mhm.
fine. You know, I mean, I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. It was fine. But 2016. So really, only 2 years later, another I guess you could say a totally different iteration of Godzilla comes out, and this movie, Shin Godzilla, in some ways, kind of breaks certain taboos with the Godzilla subgenre, right? So Shin Godzilla is different. How is Shin Godzilla different? Why is this such a great film?
It is a crazy film, and it has been interpreted as a right-wing reactionary, sort of revanchist film, as well as a left-wing anti-imperialist film, sort of all over the place. It leans into the documentary style of the original, like but on steroids. I mean, it's like watching The West Wing or a similar kind of show. You know, fast talking government bureaucrats sort of scenes dominate it. The imagery, a lot of it's pulled from the Fukushima disaster, um, and it returns Godzilla to this horror sort of image of him. They use for inspiration the original costume and the original concept art, in which, you know, those aren't supposed to be scales that Godzilla has. Those are actually, that's keloid scars from nuclear radiation. Um, and this iteration is consuming nuclear waste at the bottom of Tokyo Bay, left by the Americans. Um, when he arrives, you know, there's all these sort of unprepared science advisors talking to the government, and they're like, oh, once it gets on land, it won't be able to walk. The square cube law, it's fine. And he gets on land and he's walking, and they're like, what's going on? And you know, the prime minister will, in one moment, assure people that things are okay, and then in the next moment, things get worse because they're unprepared. And there's sort of a theme at work, you know, of like the government's lack of preparedness. The um, the right wing interpretation of the meaning of the film comes from, in particular, how they go through all of the steps that it would take for the Japanese military in this situation if it were to happen in real life, you know, or some equivalent one. Obviously, this isn't something that could happen in real life, but for them to use their own military for their own defense. And that's sort of a critique of the way the law is structured, the way the Constitution is structured, that limits Japanese sovereignty in regards to its military.
Which is, by the way, the central grievance of Japanese right wingers for generations
Exactly.
now, right? I mean, it's the organizing principle around what it means to be a conservative right winger in Japan, is to sort of feel that the modern state of Japan robs you of your sovereignty, your right to have a military, etc. Right? So
Yeah.
this is straight up right wing propaganda.
So it is like, you know, as the way it's carried out, it definitely has that right wing thread to it, and you can have a kind of right wing take that's still anti-U.S. imperialist. Um, so, you know, I'm unsure. I think that is part of it. Hideaki Anno is the guy who was the director. He also did Neon Genesis Evangelion. He's very generally kind of radical, kind of critical of capitalism, etc. But this film, and its funding and its the way that it was promoted, was part of a package deal that Shinzo Abe was putting out at the time, trying to promote Japanese culture, revive the film industry, and so on. Um, so, you know, there's clearly some degree of, we want you to show this in this film, please.
Well, and
And they do.
there's some element of, like, you know, it's Godzilla for a new generation,
Mhm.
right? It's Godzilla. It's Godzilla for young people, and the Godzilla for young people is a right wing one,
Yeah,
because the right is cool,
I can see that. Yeah, yeah.
anti-establishment. I'm
The
not
way
saying that's
no,
my
yeah, yeah. The
interpretation of the
way
film,
a
but I know
lot
that's one way to read
it
it.
is, and the way a lot of from my experience, often just I have other things that I have to do. I don't have time to learn Japanese and spend some time in Japan, but I'd like to at some point. But I have talked to some Japanese fans. Um, their general take is that the fandom doesn't see it as a right-wing movie. That there's a segment of the general population that does, but it's not widely received that way. It was far and away the most popular Godzilla movie in Japan since the original. Um, Blew the box office out of the water in Japan, and and I think for good reason. It's really well put together. It's very clever. Um, it manages to thread the line between the tragedy and the comedy of a lot of these Godzilla films. Kind of captures that spirit of Ishiro Honda in a way that I don't think anything else has since his films. Um, so even though Godzilla is frightening looking and terrifying, and the devastation is stunning, there's kind of a moment where people are uh, younger people are working together to come up with a creative solution to the problem, because the Americans are about to nuke the city. Again, it's always the Americans are coming to nuke the city kind of thing, or the Russians, or somebody's going to come nuke the city if the monster's
Well,
not taken care of.
that's kind of the idea, right?
Mhm.
Though, like the young generation is the one that's gonna like protect Japan and make Japan great again.
Right. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. And they have help from American officers that disobey their general's orders and like lend them a fleet of drones. So there's like a whole fleet of drones like swarming in on Godzilla at one point. Um, so yeah, there's it's hard to you definitely cannot read this as just an out and out left wing movie by far. Um, I would not say that. I would say that there's definitely like there's a right wing thread in it, but it's maybe in a sense undermined in the film. But yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about it a little more.
All right. So we are just past the 1 hour mark. I want to close out with your top 5 movies, not necessarily top 5, but 5 that you think are very, very important politically, for any, politically minded left winger who likes monster movies and who's, a movie nerd in the way that we are. What are some of these movies that you think are really critical? And at the end, I'm gonna throw you a curveball and see if you've actually seen the movie that I want to talk about with you. But I'm not going to tell you which one it is until we get to the
Okay,
end.
cool.
All right, go ahead. Give me your first monster movie that leftists must see.
It's not even a Japanese one. It's Korean. It's The Host. The Host is one of the best kaiju films out there. It opens with this really ridiculous scene of an American officer telling his Korean counterpart, because they had this sort of like dual system, like an American superior over the Korean, and he's telling him to dump all this stuff in the water in the river, and he's like, this is the city's drinking water, and he's like, I told you to dump it. And so he dumps it, and that's what creates this monster. And there's all this. It's very left wing. It is just out and out. Like there's a lot of commentary about how all of these people were involved with overthrowing the military regime, and now they've been left behind, and their comrades who were opportunists are now getting rich, and the US's interventions continually make things worse and worse. They are gassing the whole river area zone, and the gas is making people sick, and it's not affecting the monster, etc. It's funny. It's a dark comedy, and it is deeply funny. So The Host is top of the list.
And of course, for people who don't know The Host, this is Bong Joon-ho, and Bong Joon-ho is probably most well known now for the Oscar-winning film Parasite several years ago, and he has several movies and you mentioned left wing. I mean, The Host is very left wing. He made another overtly left-wing film that I absolutely adore called Snowpiercer.
Oh yeah, Snowpiercer.
The original Snowpiercer, which then I believe it spawned a TV show that's much inferior to the film. But regardless, Bong Joon-ho is
incredible.
I mean, every lefty has to see all of his films pretty much. I think it's required. All right, Jase, number 2. Right, what's the next one?
This is another one that's a little non-standard. It's recent.
Oh wait, I didn't even do this one. Oh damn, I didn't put up this image. That's a fun image.
It is.
All right, go ahead.
It is. So,
I love that movie.
Yeah, it is delightful. So the next one is very strange. It's colossal. It's got Anne Hathaway in it and Jason Sudeikis, and sort of there's this thing where at given times when she's standing in this certain place, she on the other side of the earth in, I think it's South Korea, embodies a kaiju avatar. And there's this whole thing of like working through your demons and so on. And there's this character played by Jason Sudeikis who's at first kind of like this fun guy. And we're in this sort of rom-com, like big girl from the city coming back to her roots and small town guy. Oh, it's going to be love. But he's an abusive alcoholic. And the way they handle that is very, very just accurate. Having lived with people who've been like this before, it's just stunningly accurate. And it takes the sort of psychology of monstrosity seriously. And it's fun. And I think it's accessible to people. And it's a more modern movie. So that's my second.
I have not seen that movie. I don't even know if I knew of its existence until you mentioned it to me, to be perfectly honest with you. So that one I'm definitely going to check out. All right. Give me another one that lefties have to see.
Yeah, so this is boring because we talked about it so much. Just Godzilla, the original, 1954. I would say try to get the Japanese version.
Absolutely. It's on Criterion. It's available in many different places.
And
by the way, I'm going to be doing go
ahead.
No, I'm sorry. We were having a little bit of a video lag. Go ahead, Jase.
I was going to say the King of the Monsters version with Raymond Burr is also enjoyable. I would say watch the Japanese one first, and then you will enjoy the Raymond Burr one and his melodrama quite a bit more.
Yep, totally agree. Okay, give me another one.
Okay, so I'm torn because I don't want to be boring, but I feel like I'm.
I mean, you have to give the obvious one, I think, right? I mean, the most obvious one of all, right?
Which would be Shin Godzilla.
Well, no, I was thinking I was thinking 1933 King Kong, right?
Okay, I mean, yeah.
I don't know. That would I would think that's a required one just for the historical.
If you were,
importance
if you're trying to be like
film.
And I wrote a really long essay. I should have shared it with you on this a while back because I think it is sort of the birth of the giant monster genre. You have all of this imagery of slavery and colonialism, and thrown right into the streets of New York City. You have this interesting case where they made this, big black hominid monster to play on racial fears. But many people began rather to identify with the monster. And a number of, there's sort of anecdotes of like black viewers in the 30s watching it and sort of looking at Kong as a symbol of black strength rather than, this sort of negative bestial image. And then that's kind of complicated because then you have other folks who are saying like you shouldn't identify with that because of the bestial aspects of it, and so on. But after that, the Kong movies, they sort of had to address this. They had to address the fact that Kong is loved. Not he's almost never just like the bad guy after that film. And like their attempts to make him the bad guy kind of fall flat. And in the newer ones, the Skull Island ones, which I think is the best iteration of Kong, he's like this protector of his island. He lives in harmony with these other weird animals, some of them monstrous, some of them just like, there's like this big yak looking creature, and it's part plant as well. Like there's all these creatures that are like part plant, part animal, blending these aspects of nature. But that original Kong film, which we could spend a whole hour talking about, we don't have that time. It, I think, is one of the greatest examples of attempting to make a shallow, racist exploitation movie and utterly failing. And instead of making like just an incredibly shot, very well acted, the special effects for the time are just far and away, like they're better than stuff that came 30 years later, 40 years later.
It's so like, here's the thing about that movie, even leaving aside all of the politics of it and everything that you've mentioned, how many movies from 1933 can you think of that you can just sit down and watch beginning to end and just be enraptured the whole time?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like a lot of movies from that
pacing,
era are hard to relate to. They're hard to stick with. Even the dialogue oftentimes feels weird and just not, I don't know, something about that movie is it's not only is it a classic, but it's like timeless in a sense, because it's just so fun to watch. I mean, I've watched it so many times, and it's like one of those movies that if it's on Turner Classic Movies, I'm going to sit there and watch it. It always happens.
Yeah, when it was showing in theaters again, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, I had to see it in theaters, and I saw that in the original Godzilla, like almost like back to back.
I saw the original Godzilla, the brand new, the new print for the whatever anniversary it was, when Film Forum in New York City did the new print of. My wife and I went. It must have been around 2014. It must have been when the 2014 version came out. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, now that I think about it, of course, right? Because 2014 was the 60th anniversary. They must have done the new print for the 60th. Right. Yeah.
And we're coming up on 2024, and in 4 days, Toho's supposed to show us images for the new Godzilla film, which is supposed to be set in the 50s, in like a remake.
Very interesting. Very interesting. That's exciting. You follow this stuff a lot more than I do. All right. You gave me, I think, 3 or 4. Okay.
Counting King Kong.
All right. Give me. All right. We're gonna do 6 then, I guess. Go ahead. Give me another one.
Well, yeah. Shin Godzilla was my.
Shin Godzilla. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So Shin Godzilla, for the reasons that we've mentioned, and it's sort of like, it was a sensation in Japan, and it really captures the full range of emotions that these kaiju movies can do. It blends a lot of the sort of modern stuff. Like they use the old music, and not new versions of the old music. They use the old tracks as they were recorded. So there's a little bit of a strange thing where you're seeing a modern movie, and then like the sound is like, whoa, this is music that was recorded in the 1960s, and it's interesting. But it's sort of like a little time capsule, I feel like, of kaiju films in general, and it makes the political stuff just right there in your face. And it's enjoyable. It's a little, the last third drags a bit, but in general, I think that's just one that everyone should see if you're going to be looking at these from this perspective. If I was giving 5 films that are just fun, that would be, a very different list.
All right, hit me with another one. Give me one more.
I'm trying to. The one I want to say is the one that no one's going to be able to get a copy of. It was hellish for me to get a copy. It's the North Korean film, Pulgasari. It came out in 1985. It involved this complicated story of a South Korean film director and an actress, his wife, girlfriend, something, who were kidnapped in Macau and taken to North Korea and forced to make films. But really, it seems like they were defecting, and there was some. But then, maybe they wanted to go back, and then they couldn't, so they were kind of under house arrest. it's complicated. We're not really sure the full story, but it's Kim Jong Il sort of was wanted this film, and he wanted a kaiju film, and they brought over the same team that made Godzilla 1985 to this one, and it shows in the suit and some other stuff. There's the imagery is directly like parallel, and if you get an opportunity to see it, I mean, it is like literally an anti-capitalist allegory. It's kind of explicit, hits you over the head. The people are starving because they're being oppressed by the ruling class, and the monster sort of inspires them and helps them in their rebellion. But then the monster turns on them and is devouring them. So it's I don't know. It's very culturally significant, and I wish it was more widely available. There's ways to watch bits of it. I got my hands on a whole version of the film from a friend of mine who was in South Korea. He just had like a physical like disc thing that he like put in for me to watch, and I got to see the whole thing. But that one is top of the list, at least to know something about.
Well, if your friend is my friend that is in South Korea, and I think it is a mutual friend, then I'm going to demand that he play it for me as well. All right, Jace, give me one more. I think. Well, I don't know. Are you going to mention one of my favorite movies of the 2010s?
Pacific Rim.
Yeah.
Yes. So Pacific Rim.
I love that movie so much. Pacific Rim 1, of course.
Yes. The second one we just don't speak of. So Pacific Rim, I adore. It's a beautifully put together film. Guillermo del Toro cares about the genre, and really it shows.
One of the few movies I can remember seeing in the theater multiple times.
Yeah, and the premise is sort of silly, and some of the parts are maybe a little cartoonish, but it works because of it takes itself seriously within that world. It doesn't try to make fun of itself like a lot of Hollywood films do.
That's Del Toro's genius.
Yeah.
That's what he's able to do. Hellboy is the same. I mean, his movies really, they have that serious quality to them, and yet are fun and awesome.
It made the word kaiju like a common thing for us to speak of. It's the same studio that did Godzilla. This sort of their test run for kaiju films, and the thing that they eliminated in the sequel that's trash. The thing that's so philosophically interesting to me is this notion of the drift. So in the film, these monsters they don't know why, they're coming out of some sort of portal in the Pacific Ocean, and they just go to the nearest population center and kill until they're destroyed. And it's exhausting the world trying to kill them. Like, it takes days of military bombardment to take them down. And so eventually they build giant robots. That's what you do, in this scenario. You build giant robots to fight, naturally. Yeah. But the trick is that the sort of, they're controlled through the sort of neural link, but one human brain isn't enough. There needs to be the sort of multiplication factor of having two human brains, at least, in sync. And
can I just say,
sure, go ahead.
They introduce one of my favorite phrases from any movie that I could ever think of. I even named one of my fantasy baseball teams after that. They were the neural handshake. Yes. I love the phrase neural handshake. It's just so simple and beautiful.
It really is. And so there's a kind of, message at work where, rather than just being these like, oh, tough guys, we've got the robots. Instead, they have to have authentic relationships with each other. And if they don't have authentic relationships with each other, that's going to disrupt the drift, and they're going to lose control of their giant mech, the Jaegers. So that sort of thing of like, if you're going to fight monsters and not become monsters yourself, you need authentic relationships with people, is just sort of a message that emanates from that movie for me. It's visually, it's beautiful. It's fast-paced. Characters are interesting. The kaiju Jaeger fights are just cool. They're just so cool.
And there's There's so little sunlight. There's
Hmm.
so little light. You know what I mean? There's so much
Hmm.
rain and darkness and shadow, and it's just visually. I found it to be. It's funny that I haven't talked about it in several years, but I mean, I guess it's been 10 years really since the movie came out, right? And
Hmm.
it's just like one of my more memorable movie going experiences of the last 10 to 15 years. Now,
Yeah,
I wouldn't say it's the best movie I've seen in
sure.
the last 15 years, but it's one of the more memorable experiences,
In
theatrical experiences.
in terms of like that big budget, fun CGI movie, it is. I just feel like, I mean, there's some other movies that have better writing and so on, I guess, but it just does that job. It does it well. It does it without needing sequels, without needing 100 prequels, without needing a shared universe, without needing all,
And of
it
course,
tells
they
a
forced
story.
all of those things anyway.
Yeah, and
They
it didn't
forced
work.
all of those things anyway.
Yeah.
But, and the thing is, if you watch, and I mean, I know that this is totally apples and oranges, they're completely different movies. But like, if you watch Pacific Rim, then movies like Transformers are unwatchable.
Yeah.
You cannot sit through them because they're just like, you're like, no, Pacific Rim is the movie.
Yeah.
That's the fun movie. The rest of this is just shit.
Yeah. It's just, and they got around the American military stuff by just not having that kind of military stuff in the movie. They're like, we don't need we don't need like a big contract with the Pentagon because we're just not going to show your stuff. We've got super sci-fi planes and stuff. That's all. None of that stuff is needed. So that was a nice change because of the Godzilla movies. It's just really depressing the way the military has sort of become this central feature of the films, and yet in a totally uncritical way, they're the good guys. They're fighting with Godzilla literally in Godzilla King of the Monsters. It's like gross.
All right. I want to ask you about one more that you mentioned to me. It was well, tell me about the TV show. It was a TV show. Well, I'll just put it up there. Tell us about Ultra Q.
Ultra Q. So one of the things that I think is interesting about kaiju is that they are, initially the morphology of the monsters. They're all following things you find in nature. Lizards, bugs, dinosaurs. Things you would have found in nature a long time ago. Whatever. With Ultra Q, it's as if now that the kaiju genre is established, kaiju begin to resemble the concept of themselves more, and in the weirdness and the strangeness. You see like that image right there, Garamon, who is used later as Pigmon. These creatures get very bizarre, and Ultra Q is sort of like the Twilight Zone and the X-Files meets kaiju. It's very episodic, monster of the week kind of stuff, but it's rarely like, if at all, like monsters going to destroy the city. It's more weird stuff happens. The monster is eating all the electricity. The monster is, creeping people out. There's this one called Kanagon that spits out coins out of its mouth. There's a capitalist thing at work there that I haven't fully worked out, like what the imagery might be trying to say. So anyway, it's very interesting. That's the show where I got this concept of unbalance. That was their original title, and it's like the sensibility that you get of nature being sick. It's out of balance. Something's fundamentally wrong, and the in these episodes of the show, there's sort of what happens is they uncover the fact that the reality that we live in is very strange, and it is producing things that we couldn't imagine. So it was really popular in Japan, taken pretty seriously. But then after that, they're like, look, we can't do a repeat of the show. Let's lean into the kaiju, especially the bigger ones, and let's give them a superhero to fight. So the sequel, the next show is Ultraman, and it begins the Ultraman universe, which is a huge thing in Japan. And Ultraman fandom is much bigger in Japan than Godzilla by a long shot. The Godzilla fandom only really revived in the last like 10 years in Japan. but and Ultraman has had this like huge influence around the world and so on, and it has a connection to Ultra Q. There's a Neo Ultra Q show that came out within the last 10 years. I can't remember exactly when. It's pretty good, but it's still the high weirdness of 1960s black and white. Where you've got like one episode, there's a kaiju that's like King Kong, but he's sort of like human sized and he's on a train. It's weird. It's weird and it's interesting.
Where can you get it? Is it on YouTube? Do you know? I
think so. You can it's put out by Shout Factory now, so in a lot of streaming sites you can get it now. I have
it might be on Arrow now that I think about it.
Yeah, it's been off and on Prime and other stuff, so it should be available somewhere.
I'm going to check that one out. I haven't seen that, and I did not realize that was the origin of Ultraman. That's very interesting. Okay, we're almost out of time, and by almost out of time, I mean I want to throw one out at you that I don't actually know if you've seen this movie. So if the answer is I've never seen it and I don't know what you're talking about, then that's going to be the end of that. It'll be an awkward pause. So here's the question for you. Are you familiar with well, I guess it was a trilogy, really. The trilogy Daimajin.
Yes.
So let's talk for just a couple of minutes about Daimajin, because I happened to come across Daimajin. I'd never heard of this trilogy, and it blew me away. This movie, the first one and the second one, and actually you could make an argument the second one's better than the first one because it has much more of the monster. It's an amazing movie in so many ways because it's kind of a kaiju film, but kaijus are sort of like, I don't know, they're like the product of atomic energy or something like that. They're like a natural form that is somehow modified or whatever, right?
Right.
Daimajin isn't. Daimajin is this like demon demigod that comes out of the mountains. So it's like this direct Shinto connection, right, to the Shinto spiritual framework, right? But it's also kind of a kaiju film, and it's also shot and paced and told definitely like a samurai film. I mean, it's very much of that. It's the most incredible mixture of these different forms of storytelling. I was blown away by this movie. Go ahead.
It is so very good. So it's done by Toho, is the company that did Godzilla films. Daiei was the rival.
There's the Daimajin, by the way.
It's gone out of business and been bought up and returned like 3 times. I don't know what the name of the company is now, but so Daimajin and Gamera, the giant fire-breathing turtle, those were their sort of kaiju genre entries at the time. But Daimajin, all 3 of them came out within the same year, and they are all period pieces. They're set in the kind of medieval Japanese setting, like you said, sort of samurai films, sort of revenge films. Daimajin is the Dai in that is like in Daikaiju. It's the same. So it's like this sort of giant god, this giant demon god. It's a statue that comes to life at certain moments when people call upon it in distress, and they're calling for justice. And so there's like this scene where he picks up the sort of evil oppressor lord and literally like crucifies him, which is an incredible scene.
Good. It's so good. It's so good.
So yes, and Daimajin also has, I haven't talked about this, the music of Godzilla is iconic, and it's because the guy who did it, Akira Ifukube, he was a major composer. He wasn't just some guy. He was a major composer. And the uniqueness of his sound is that he was trained classically, but he lived many years in Hokkaido and studied the music of the Ainu indigenous people. And he incorporates their musical sensibility and style into a lot of his stuff. And that's where the kind of the strangeness and the interestingness, I feel like that blend is what we get. So he does the music of Daimajin as well, and I think it's his best score. It's really somber and moving, and it really, in some ways, that music is as much a part of the kaiju genre as the visuals. And you feel it when it's missing, when there are films that don't have it at all or any hint of it. Like you can feel like the difference in, let's say, Godzilla versus Kong doesn't do any of it. But in Godzilla King of the Monsters, they really lean into that music, and that's like the most powerful part of the movie. It's the most like emotionally moving part of the movie is this powerful score that's added to it. And the Kong score is just like, what are we doing? I don't know. It's loud. Monsters are breaking things. That's all that's happening. So Daimajin, I think, has the best soundtrack of any of the Fukabe's. It sets the mood.
It's so good.
It's so good, and you can see his influence. Well, the degree to which he worked on stuff with Kurosawa is really understated. More and more information about Honda has come out. Like, he really co-directed a lot of stuff with Kurosawa, especially in the later part of his life. And you can see that the fingerprints of that on here. It's not a Kurosawa film. Okay, so it's I'll tell you, like, it's not that good, but you can see that world at work in this. And the only reason I just initially think of including it is it's such a borderline case of, this is a statue that's come to life. It's the God element of it directly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's debatable if it's really a kaiju film, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's part of what's great about it. It's kind of it's kind of.
I love it when we blend the stuff, and the host is another one where people sort of like, well, yeah, okay, the size isn't the kaiju, but the way it came to be and everything that makes it a kaiju, so it's fine. Well, in the same way, Daimajin, the morphology may not be directly kaiju, but the sensibility. And then we've got this music, we've got all this other stuff. It's it's a kaiju film.
Oh man, and that scene that you're talking about, I had to grab this.
Yeah,
I mean, come on! You see that still? I mean, that movie has to be watched.
Good.
It's fun.
I've been trying to get my hand on a Daimajin figure for a long time. I have a large collection of Godzilla stuff. My child gets some of it too, but I've been looking for a good Daimajin for a long time. They're really rare and really expensive. So, but there's been a re-release and stuff of it, and I think there's they've tried several times to do some new version of Daimajin, and it's been bad every time and sort of buried. But there's a word they're trying to do a new version of it, and I'm hoping that there will be nice new shiny figures that I can have on my desk.
All right, what are you okay, last question. What are you excited for? There's another Godzilla coming, right?
Yeah, well, there's going to be more legendary films. There's this Godzilla and Kong follow-up, and I enjoy them. They're good. They're for what they are. They're fine.
Yeah, they're fine. I mean, whichever one is the one where they go into the hollow earth and all of
Godzilla
the monsters are living in there.
And we're doing all that fun now. That's there's more of that coming,
I'm sure.
And the new anime of Skull Island that's on Netflix is actually good. It's actually pretty well put together. There's but I, more than anything, I have wanted a modern sort of update of that original Godzilla film. I know they're going to fuck it up somehow, but this is supposedly what they're doing now. We're going to find out in a few days. We'll see if the rumors are true and if this is what they're going to be making. But that's what I'm most excited for, is what Toho is going to do with this next film.
Very exciting stuff. Jase, thanks for chatting with us tonight.
Yeah.
Jase Short, professor of philosophy, focusing in ancient philosophy, science fiction, monsters, and a whole lot more. Follow Jase on Facebook, on social media. Jase is a wealth of knowledge and information on this stuff, and he's a great guy. Thanks, Jase.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.
Viewers, as always, thank you. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. Lots of exclusive stuff there. You could watch Jase vape, all sorts of things. Anyway, go over there. Talk to you next.